Okay, welcome everyone. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, which we hope is a number of folks who are able to access this afterwards, my name is Melissa Beatty. I am the vice chair on the U.S. Biosphere Network Steering Committee, calling in today from a beautiful, sunny, hot Colorado. It's supposed to be 90 degrees, which is very unusual for the beginning of June, but still very nice outside. So excited for all of you who are coming in across the country. This is the latest installment of Biosphere Bites, the U.S. Biosphere Network's bi-weekly 30-minute talk, highlighting work being done to improve human connection to nature and make progress towards sustainable development goals in the biosphere regions. Talks are recorded, so we are recording this and it will be posted to YouTube for later viewing. This is going to be a great resource for folks as we work towards our periodic reviews. Just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. I think you all know this already. Make sure to mute yourself if you're not presenting. And then, or asking a question during the Q&A. We'll have some Q&A time at the end. You can also put questions in the chat. I'll be tracking them so that following the talk, we can have a robust discussion. And also feel free, I know a lot of us know each other on this call, but if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be wonderful as well, and let us know where you're tuning in from. I'd love to introduce today's speaker. I'm going to be brief because John is really a wealth of knowledge and want to give him ample time to present his materials. Today's speaker is John Dennis. During his time with the National Park Service, John played a pivotal role in various international initiatives and contributed to NPS's involvement in the U.S. Man in the Biosphere Program. He continues to be a champion for the U.S. Biosphere Network. We feel very fortunate that he continues to do so, and he will be speaking to us today about the origin, the role, and the importance of periodic reviews in helping biosphere regions be successful and long-lasting. So John, I'm going to pull up your slides, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa.
Get this slide pulled up. Okay, are you able to see it?
Yes, thank
Awesome.
you. In looking at the periodic review, I think it's important to ask where did it come from and how did that origin influence the way the periodic review is thought about and structured. But I have to give a disclaimer here. While the previous talks in the Biosphere Bites series have talked about interesting places and interesting people, this one is 100% bureaucracy. So you'll have to bear with that. The goal is to go through some of the background of the periodic review and look at how it fits into the overall program, and then some encouragement to get started at the end. Next slide, please. There are a couple of points to push here, and that is that MAB is an international effort. It started out of international science that was developed during the Cold War era, so people who didn't like each other were still able to work together in the science world. One of these early on was the International Polar Year. There were two of those. In 1951, someone said, why don't we have a third International Polar Year? And before all the talking was done, they did from polar to global, so it became the International Geophysical Year. That ran from 1957 to 1958, a year and a half year, because they wanted both hemispheres to have a full year. This effort also spawned World Data Centers and the first scientific satellite. The biologists didn't want to be left behind, and learning from the success of the International Geophysical Year, as early as 1961, they started formally looking at how do we have an international biological program, which got up and running in 1967 and ran through 1974. The International Biological Program was a science program, but it also had a conservation focus in terms of wanting to describe ecosystems that warranted conservation and also biological resources. In the middle of all that, people began to realize that the human component was missing from the previous science efforts, and that spawned a 1968 UNESCO Biosphere Conference that looked at how do we bring humans into the process. And their focus was the scientific basis for the rational use and conservation of the resources of the biosphere. That led to discussions initiated in 1970, the establishment of MAB in 1971, a couple of years focused on what are biosphere reserves all about that included our colleague Tom Gilbert as a Park Service employee for several years in Paris. And that led to the designation of the first biosphere reserves in 1976. Next slide, please. The MAB of today has some specific purposes that it has identified, and it has some specific purposes for the Biosphere Reserve specifically. And in this list, I would emphasize international, intergovernmental being international, science, improving human livelihoods, safeguarding, which is another way of saying conserve ecosystems, and make things sustainable. The Biosphere Reserves similarly are focused as being learning places, as sites for scientific testing and demonstration, interdisciplinary, and with a focus on sustainable development. Next slide, please. After the initiation of biosphere reserves in 1976, they sort of chugged along doing their own thing, with probably most of the MAB focus being on international science and not so much on the places. But by 1995, they realized the biosphere reserves were not achieving the purpose for which they had been established. So the MAB convened a conference that produced two seminal documents that I recommend you read if you haven't, or reread if you have some time ago. The first is the Seville Strategy for Biosphere Reserves, and it helped establish a vision for what biosphere reserves are. The second component is the statutory framework for biosphere reserves, which has, I think, 12 articles, roughly 11 or 12, but the three that are germane to the periodic review process are Article 3, which establishes clearly the three functions of a biosphere reserve, Article 4, which establishes a series of criteria for an area to be a biosphere reserve, and Article 9, which establishes the concept of periodic review, including that the review should be done every 10 years based on a report submitted by the Biosphere Reserve. That report in turn is reviewed and used by the Interagency Advisory Committee for Biosphere Reserves, which is a MAB committee, to determine what kind of recommendation that committee makes to the International Coordinating Council. And the International Coordinating Council makes the decision, and the choices are: progress is satisfactory, it remains in the list of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. Progress is partial but not completely satisfactory, their improvement is needed, and some recommendations are offered as to how to achieve that improvement, and a certain amount of time is granted to the Biosphere Reserve to develop the improvement. And then the third choice is for those that clearly are not meeting the criteria of a biosphere reserve is to remove them from the list of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. The next slide, please. The periodic review is a useful tool, even though it's a bureaucratic nightmare in some respects. It is mandated, so you will do it if you wish to remain in the World Network of Biosphere Reserves, but it is a review that helps you organize and guide the biosphere reserves. It encourages introspection. What are you doing and how are you achieving that kinds of things? It asks questions to help you realize what you're doing and what you are short on. And it provides a framework for achieving the introspection, answering the questions it asks, and showing the effectiveness of the Biosphere Reserve as a collaborative demonstration activity. And those two words are important. Collaborative is crucial for biosphere reserves. Demonstration is the purpose of the Biosphere Reserve. And then, as I've touched on, but I will reemphasize here, the periodic review is the key document for a biosphere seeking to renew its recognition. It, one, demonstrates what the Biosphere Reserve has accomplished in the previous 10 years, or almost 10 years, because it takes a while to write a periodic review. Importantly, it shows what the Biosphere Reserve plans to do for the next 10 years, and it is the only source document for the IACBR to review. Next slide, please. The man in the Biosphere Program review of periodic reviews is important to keep in mind. One is that the International Advisory Committee for Biosphere Reserves is made up of members from around the world, from different biosphere reserves from around the world. Those people are peers to biosphere reserves, and the deliberations they make and the recommendation they make goes to the International Coordinating Council. The IACBR meets annually. The International Coordinating Council is the one, excuse me, that formally decides whether or not to retain the Biosphere Reserve in the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. The ICC also meets annually, which means that there is a specific window for submitting periodic reviews, and it's important to pay attention to that window. Next slide, please. And I'll be a little reiterative here as well in terms of looking at the importance of getting started early. For most of our biosphere reserves, our first acceptable periodic reviews were submitted roughly in the time period 2015 to 2017. There were a few that got some time extensions from MAB, so they are more in the 2018, 2019 era. That means the next periodic reviews are due starting in 2025. That means submitted to MAB within the time schedule. Starting now gives lead time for doing some important things. One is to identify and then develop collaborations that may not yet exist. Another is to look at how the governance documents for the Biosphere Reserve are structured, reassessing that structure and updating those strategies if necessary. The updating process will necessarily involve the collaborations. Another important advantage in getting started is it gives time for developing the specific collaborative action plans for the next 10 years. It also then gives time to enter the accomplishments that have been identified, the collaborations that exist and have been identified, the updated governance strategies, and the next 10-year plan. And putting all of that into the periodic review format, which format is a little tedious because it is a document generated under international collaboration. So it picks up different ways of looking at things, and it is also redundant. And finally, lead time gives opportunity to obtain useful peer review for the draft periodic review. And lastly, I forgot to put on the slide here, under the current US process, a peer review is submitted by the Biosphere Reserve through the State Department to the MAB office. So there's needs to be time to work with the State Department. Next slide, please. I'm going to very quickly run through the periodic review outline and identify the topics that are there, and then mention how many subtopics there are under each topic. And this is a little vague because it's hard to figure out sometimes whether a header is a question in and of itself or whether a header is merely a header. But anyhow, that's what I will do. And one element I've not included here because it's merely a statement of the sort of the situation of the Biosphere Reserve, where it is in the world, what its boundaries look like, factual things like that. Looking at the individual topics, the first one on the list I have is asking you to identify significant changes during the past 10 years. And I count 26 different subtopics within this topic. The key summary is that one is to summarize what changes have occurred and what's been done about that, and the other is to identify and discuss any matters of special interest. The second topic is ecosystem services. There are 4 subtopics there, and clearly it focuses around what the biology is doing and how it's used for various purposes. Next slide, please. This slide shows the 3 functions in the periodic review and in the statutory framework. Each function has its own topic section, and you can see that there are a fair number of subtopics, especially with the logistics topic, which in a way is perhaps the most complicated because it covers so much. Next slide, please. Now we get into some of the really busy parts of the periodic review with the topic on governance, biosphere reserve management, and coordination. 24 subtopics covering a whole host of activities, thinking, concerns, whatever. It focuses heavily on coordination, on involving the stakeholders throughout the process. The next one is looking at the criteria for the Biosphere Reserve and the progress that has been made. There are 9 subtopics here. Again, focusing on things like representativeness, inclusiveness, the demonstration function of the Biosphere Reserve, the logistics function, and then it also wants to make sure that the Biosphere Reserve is appropriately sized and zoned to serve the 3 functions. And then the last topic in the list is to provide supporting documents. And there are 7 supporting documents that it asks for, such as a vegetation map or an updated vegetation map if the previous one has been changed, an updated list of species, and other things like that. Next slide, please. The USBN plans to help with preparing periodic reviews, and I've identified some here. One that's underway now is a project at the University of Michigan that seeks to increase USBN support for the collaboration among biosphere regions. And that is an important component because one of the stresses from the MAB world as a whole is that MAB is a collaborative activity, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And the goal here will be to have collaboration of our biosphere regions among each other and with biosphere regions in other nations. The second component is to provide resources that will help make periodic reviews successful. And the third is to help demonstrate the value of biodiversity conservation and social, economic, environmental development practices. The second source of help is from the USBN coordinator and the federal liaison, who are direct sources of technical assistance and who can provide links to experts in biosphere regions, links to experienced volunteers, and help identify peer reviewers for those biosphere regions who would like to utilize a peer reviewer. The biosphere regions themselves, of course, contain people who could be experienced volunteers to help other biosphere regions. Beyond that, there are plans that there will be webinars about specific components of the periodic review process, and then hopefully in 2025, an in-person workshop. And based on the workshop, in-person workshop, the US MAB program held in Estes Park in 2016, I strongly urge that if there is an in-person workshop, that each biosphere region get itself to that workshop. Next slide, please. The key points as a reminder, sort of a summary from this talk, is that the periodic review itself is not trivial. It is due every 10 years if you wish to remain a member of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. The periodic review demonstrates the eligibility to be in the World Network. The periodic review is a public document, and the periodic review addresses specifically the criteria in the MAB statutory framework. So again, I urge you to reread the statutory framework. The periodic review shows the effectiveness of a biosphere reserve as a demonstration activity. And that's an important purpose of the Biosphere Reserve that is often lost in the day-to-day activities. US biosphere regions last submitted their periodic reviews almost a decade ago, and so they are due, they're coming up. Biosphere reserves fundamentally are relationships, and this is built into the concept from the international right down to the local community. And I was struck that one of the questions that a previous Biosphere Bite attendee asked of Chris Groves is, once you establish a relationship, how do you keep it going? And I argue that preparing a periodic review is a tool for maintaining relationships because it requires collaboration over time among all the partners. And note the collaboration itself takes time, that once achieved, it can reduce chances for unwanted surprises, such as would occur if a periodic review is published and talks about what one of the partners is planning to do for the next 10 years. And it turns out that partner was never contacted about those plans. And lastly, on the key points, the most important in my mind is to start now. Next slide, please. This slide deck, I presume, will be available through the chat link. I just wanted to point out that it gives you URLs for some key documents relating to the origin of the periodic review and the form itself, and the technical guidelines for biosphere reserves that are available. And the last slide, please. The U.S. Biosphere Reserve Program has had some serious downers, which led to a 10-year or more hiatus in whatever it was doing. And so it is still coming up and out of that hiatus. One of the problems it has is the word reserve, and we think we've solved that by calling ourselves biosphere regions, which is actually a better description, since the region encompasses not only reserves, but also actively managed areas, actively utilized areas. A second word that has caused problem is the UNESCO word statutory framework. From a UNESCO viewpoint, I think statutory may be correct because I think they had to vote on it. From the US standpoint, statutory implies law, which implies sovereignty, which is what led to the decline of the US biosphere reserves, was a fight over whether or not the UN held sovereignty over United States property, which of course it doesn't, but the word statutory created confusion. The third word, which has actually been addressed in law relating to wilderness, designated wilderness areas, is the word or phrase buffer zone. That is a bad word in the United States, and as a result, and also the word transition area, phrase transition area, is not clear as to what it means from our perspective. So the US, and you'll see this in the Rocky Mountain Periodic Review from 2016, the US, or 2015 even, the US has adopted core protected area for the MAB core area, managed use area for the MAB buffer zone, and area of cooperation and partnership for the MAB transition area. So keep those in mind as you work on your periodic reviews. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that great overview. So helpful to just hear the background and understand why periodic reviews are important. There's a lot of conversation in the chat. I know we got started a couple minutes late, so I will give us maybe 1 or 2 minutes for Q&A as well. But I think that just a couple of things to highlight from the conversation in the chat, and I think that's captured in the recording as well. Yes, periodic reviews are scary. There's a lot of information that goes into them, but they also can be really helpful and really positive. And I like Brian's comment about identifying a point person or a point agency and a committee who's responsible to really have ownership of this periodic review. And there's some talk about periodic reviews, the process changing. We haven't had solid information on that yet, so we're kind of going with what we know periodic reviews to be in the past, and hope that there's some opportunity to grandfather in what you all as biosphere networks or as biosphere regions in the biosphere network are working on. And I'll just say kind of finally my last observation before I open it for questions, and John Allen says this really well. You highlighted, John Dennis, the purpose of collaboration, the purpose of working together and the importance of that. And one thing I think just for biosphere regions to know, to kind of frame, is the work of the biosphere regions is the work of the partners, right? So what are you all doing as partners working together? How do we highlight that in the periodic reviews? And so we have some resources at the network. We are planning those webinars that John mentioned to really help each of the regions with their periodic reviews. So stay tuned for more information on that. I think this is a great start to get people thinking about what is a periodic review, what gets included in them. So maybe I'll stop talking and give us 2 minutes since we just started a little late. Give us 2 minutes for Q&A and see if anyone who remains on the call has any questions for John Dennis or wants any reflections that you want to share with the whole group.
And I'll jump in quickly that this talk is based on the current periodic review questionnaire. I understand that there is talk of changing it, but I thought it would be better to work with what's out there right now in case it takes 3 or 4 years for MAB to change it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, John. Brian, go ahead.
John, thank you for an excellent presentation. I think it's a great framework for looking at the periodic reviews as they come due. One area that I noticed we had difficulties with in doing one for the Champlain Adirondacks was existing land use plans and regulatory frameworks, both in New York State and in Vermont, and then trying to overlay or integrate that with the 3 categories you just outlined in terms of core, areas of integration, et cetera. So I just want to alert people to that there is somewhat of a misfit between the UNESCO broad strokes and specific regulatory frameworks on the ground. But thanks again, John.
You're welcome. There is a misfit, but I believe that creative thinking deals with that. First off, the Biosphere region is a voluntary organization. Nobody has to be in it. Nobody has to do anything because of it. The important aspect is that each entity that joins it says, I as an entity have something to contribute. I as an entity have some authorities over the area that I manage, and I am willing to use those authorities to help achieve the broader plan, the broader goal of the entire biosphere region. And in that way, using their own authorities, they are, I hope, able to come together in a way that works. But that's the key, is that everybody involved is involved in the planning, and they sort out how the ultimate plan fits within their responsibilities and their authorities.
Thank you. And in some of these processes, we have often used the stone soup story as the metaphor.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have strict guidance from Katie, who is actually at Euromap right now in Germany, to keep this as close to 30 minutes as possible. So unless there are any other pressing questions, I just want to say thank you again, John. Lots of great resources in the chat. This was an initial introduction to periodic reviews. We'll be talking a lot more about this as a network coming up. So really, really appreciate, John, your time. John Allen, I saw you came on camera. I don't know if you have any final words as the chair of the USBN.
No, John, thank you so much. That was a really beautiful summary, concise. So we really appreciate the effort and the time you put into that. Wonderful. And we'll use this a lot over the next couple of years.
Absolutely.
And thank you for the opportunity to present it.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy your lunches for those of you who are grabbing lunch now, and look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Take care all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.